Hello, I'm Frank Hutchison.
I'm Meredith Hutchison Hartley.
And I'm Emily Geddes.
And welcome back to the Hidden History of Business podcast.
And today we're going to visit a story involving Ben Franklin and how he did in a competitor.
We kind of like to have this idea that the American founding fathers were these dignified, moral, ethical men. Yes, upright citizens, stalwarts of their community. And they had their share of scandals, and Ben Franklin certainly takes the cake on that. 40 years before the Declaration of Independence was written, Ben Franklin was a startup publisher in Philadelphia who was trying to make it in a very competitive market. And he had been running this publishing business where one of the most popular products was almanacs. Almanacs were books written by, usually they called themselves astrologers and astronomers. They said that they were reading the stars and the charts to predict the weather, to predict what crops would be like, and in some cases make some pretty broad predictions about what would happen to very famous people. Ben Franklin wanted to get on the action. And he thought he knew the business pretty well because he'd already published so many almanacs. But he didn't want everyone to know what he was doing, so he decided to use a pseudonym. He called himself Richard Saunders, and he published Poor Richard's Almanac. His gimmick was that he was this poor man who had been doing astrology for a long time, but he hadn't wanted to compete in the market, even though his wife kept bugging him because they were so poor they didn't even have a pot to cook their dinner in. They had to borrow their neighbor's pot to cook dinner. But he finally had gotten over his reservations about entering the market because his dear friend, Titan Leeds, who was a major, very popular almanac writer, he had read the stars and he knew now that Titan Leeds was going to die on a very specific date, October 12th, 1733 to be exact, at the very instant of the conjunction of the Sun and Mercury. In fact, he claimed that he and Titan Leeds, being good friends, had discussed this and they actually differed slightly. They both agreed that Titan Leeds would die in October, but Titan Leeds thought it would happen about 2 weeks later on October 26th instead. And he prints this saying that even though he feels sad for his friend, he has overcome his reservations knowing he will no longer be stealing market share from his dear friend. So this goes out under the pseudonym, and Titan Leeds responds by saying, I don't know who this guy is, and I'm not dead. Guys, I'm here. I'm totally fine. In fact, after the date passed, Titan Leeds published a statement saying, haha, I'm still alive, I'm right here. But Richard Saunders came out again with a very quick response saying, no, everyone, you don't understand. He actually did die. I received word that my dear friend Titan Leeds died, but I know he's dead. I've read that response, and I know that my friend Titan Leeds would never have written something so coarse and badly written, and I know that Titan Leeds must really be dead, and someone's impersonating him and writing under his name. This goes on for 5 years. People actually believed that Titan Leeds was dead. Even Titan Leeds' friends wrote to his wife with condolences. And this keeps escalating to the point that in one of his editions, Richard Saunders publishes that he woke up one morning to find a letter by his bedside. The ghost of Titan Leeds had entered through his nose, controlled his body to write a letter while he was asleep, telling him how sorry he was that these imposters kept attacking Richard Saunders in his name.
It's astounding to me that people believed this.
They ate it up to the point that finally, 5 years later, Titan Leeds actually died. And Richard Saunders published congratulations to his imposters for giving up the charade and finally dying.
Oh, no.
Now, there's a reason why this really worked.
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that no one realized that Ben Franklin was Richard Saunders and he was the publisher. So every time Titan Leeds published a rebuttal, Ben Franklin read it before it even hit the market and was able to write Richard Saunders' response so it hit as quickly as possible. This also enhanced his fame because he made a big splash with his first edition. People believed he really could predict things, and then they saw that he was responding faster than anyone else to what was hitting the market. So they really believed that Richard Saunders' Poor Richard's Almanac could actually predict the future. It also wasn't the first time this had happened. Years before, in London, in 1708, Jonathan Swift, that's the same Jonathan Swift who wrote the book Gulliver's Travels, was writing an almanac under the pseudonym of Isaac Bickerstaff. And he began publishing an almanac called Predictions for the Year, whatever. And in 1708, his predictions included a printed April Fool's Day prank. One of the events he predicted was that by a raging fever, famous astrologer and his competitor, John Partridge, would die at exactly 11 p.m. on March 27th of that year. Almost immediately, Partridge wrote saying, "No, this is a fraud," and that his whole design was nothing but deceit. The end of March will plainly show the cheat. On March 31st, a pamphlet entitled The Accomplishments of the First of Mr. Bickerstaff's Predictions was circulated through London, and it announced that the prediction had come true, but the timing was off by 4 hours. Partridge had died at 7:05 p.m. instead of the predicted 11 p.m. Because news spread slowly, they had to move these printed pamphlets. The news didn't really hit London until April 1st, which was April Fool's Day. And Partridge was completely enraged. He published another almanac article. He swore that Bickerstaff was a fraud. He was still alive. And Bickerstaff did exactly what Franklin would do decades later. He responded that no man could have written such rubbish under Partridge's credited authorship, and that the real Partridge was obviously dead. Plus, Bickerstaff wrote, Partridge's own wife had earlier claimed with witnesses that her husband had neither life nor soul. So obviously this poor woman had been complaining for whatever reason. People had heard her and reported it. Her quote was taken completely out of context, but she couldn't deny she said it.
Once again, context is so important.
The hoax worked. It discredited Partridge as an astrologer and eventually caused him to completely stop printing his almanac that was competing with Bickerstaff. And this was a well-known story. But Franklin was still able to replicate it across the pond with extreme efficiency. And this is a pretty common thread for Franklin. He was very good at undermining the competition and making a big splash. Now, I'm going to read you a couple of the quotes here just because I think they're absolutely hilarious. Let me pull this up really quickly. This is the very introduction to Poor Richard's Almanac. He says, "The plain truth of the matter is, I am excessive poor, and my wife, good woman, is, I tell her, excessive proud. She cannot bear, she says, to sit spinning in her shift of tow, while I do nothing but gaze at the stars, and has threatened more than once to burn all my books and rattling traps, as she calls my instruments, if I do not make some profitable use of them for good of my family. The printer has offered me some considerable share of profits, and I have thus begun to comply with my dame's desire." So not only is he portraying himself as this poor guy, but he's also praising Ben Franklin himself for giving him such generous profits, which means he's going to draw more business in to his publishing. He says, "Indeed, this motive would have had force enough to have made me publish an almanac many years since, had it not been overpowered by my regard for my good friend and fellow student, Mr. Titan Leeds, whose interest I am extremely unwilling to hurt. But this obstacle, I am far from speaking it with pleasure, is soon to be removed, since inexorable Death, who has never known to respect merit, has already prepared the mortal dart. The fatal sister has already extended her destroying shears, and that ingenious man must soon be taken from us. He dies, by my calculation made at his request, on October 12th, 1733, at 3:29 p.m., at the very instant of the conjunction of the Sun and Mercury. By his own calculation, he will survive until the 26th of the same month. This small difference between us we have disputed whenever we have met these 9 years past, but at length he is inclinable to agree with my judgment. As therefore these provinces may no longer expect to see any of his performances after this year, I think myself free to take up his task and request a share of the public encouragement, which I am more apt to hope for on this account, that the buyer of my almanac may consider himself not only as purchasing a useful utensil, but as performing an act of charity to his poor friend and servant, R. Saunders."
Classic.
It is, but this also isn't the first time in history that a fortune teller or predictor used intelligence and espionage to take down the competition and control the market.
In fact, you go back to the Greeks.
The Oracle at Delphi.
Yes.
In the city of Delphi, there were several women from the village, and they would take turns climbing the mountain to don this oracle outfit. They'd breathe in some holy smoke before answering questions from visitors. And they became extremely famous and popular for being able to not only predict the future and give people great advice, but actually control national events. They actually have discovered now that this mountain was actually expelling ethylene gas. And the women, who were usually speaking in gibberish, were actually getting high off of this gas they were inhaling through these vents in the mountain. And whenever someone came to ask them a question, it would have to be translated by these male priests. The male priests ran a network of spies who gathered intelligence on people in the local area when they saw them coming. When someone came to ask a question, the woman could be saying anything at all, but the priest was interpreting, and he was actually using his knowledge from the spy network to answer someone's questions. And in many cases, they knew national events, and so they were actually shaping them and giving people advice. But problems came when someone came to ask a question who they weren't expecting and didn't have enough intelligence on. And this is one of my favorite parts of the story, that they started requiring people to bring animals for sacrifice. And one of the rules was that the priest would have to sprinkle water on the animal, and if it shook its woolly head upon receiving the sprinkle, the visitor could go to the oracle. But if the animal didn't react, the petitioner had to turn around, go back, and try again later. This gave the priest time to go do more intelligence, but they were actually making the animal react. If they wanted the person to go through, they'd sprinkle cold water on the animal. If they didn't, they'd use warm water so the animal wouldn't react. And that gave them time to go and investigate what this person was coming for. Sometimes they just gave ambiguous answers, but in a lot of cases, they were telling people what to do to shape the local economy.
Or even in battles, what to do for those.
Yep. Now, I find all of these stories really interesting in light of a few modern trends. The first thing I find really interesting is our obsession with data security. Nowadays, we store a huge amount of information digitally, so it's accessible through the internet, we store it on the cloud, we carry it around on our phones, and all of those devices are vulnerable to people who have the skills to hack them. We see that in the press constantly. We hear about the Sony hacking, where thousands and thousands of internal emails from the production studio were released, and many of them were not complimentary, and people lost their jobs over things that were said in those emails. We see it in Anonymous, the hacker organization. Their entire purpose is to hack targeted organizations and release information so it can be used strategically against them, like in the Ashley Madison website hack, which was a website devoted to extramarital affairs. They hacked it and they released the contact information of a lot of people there, including many public servants. We live in a world where information is easily accessible in large volumes to people with the right skill set. And that creates a lot of fear, which is why I think it's really important to remind people that this is not a new thing. Because I hear that a lot from clients and other people who work in the corporate world, that they're terrified of all these new threats. Well, they're not really new threats. No matter how people have stored information, no matter where it has existed, people have always found ways to access it and use it against people, or to manipulate that information in their own favor. If Benjamin Franklin could do it with his printing press and a pseudonym, if the Oracle at Delphi could do it with a little bit of showmanship and a spy network and sprinkling water on animals, anyone can do it with any way that we store information. The second thing I find really interesting is using information against others. We see that play out in a lot of places right now. The one that stands out the most would be the political arena. In the U.S., especially during the current election season, we're very familiar with the idea of the October surprise. That's where, when you're in an election, you find out something bad about your opponent. But instead of releasing that information immediately, you save it to release in October, just a few weeks before the election. Because the idea is it'll hurt your opponent and they won't have time to recover before the election, so you're more likely to win. That's a really classic example of using a leaked story against someone. And ideally, they leak it anonymously so it doesn't come back and hit them. That's the glory of the October surprise. But there are also examples of where leaks or misinformation are used to further the agenda of the person who leaked them. This plays out a lot in the entertainment industry. So I want you to imagine that, say, you are an actor who is trying to get a part, and you can't even get an audition with the studio for this movie because they just don't seem to be interested. So you or your agent call up a gossip magazine or website and say, hey, this is totally anonymous, but I'm being considered for this part. And then the website or magazine publishes that little rumor, and the public reacts. What the actor is hoping is that the public will say, yes, oh my gosh, this person is perfect for the role. The studio will see that and let them have an audition and they'll get the part. And this has happened before legitimately. A great example recently is Sophie Turner, who is an actress on Game of Thrones. When Twitter found out that they were casting the new X-Men movie and they would be casting the part of Jean Grey, a young Jean Grey, Twitter exploded saying, "Oh my gosh, Sophie Turner would be perfect for this part." And the studio, which previously hadn't been considering her at all, suddenly brought her in for an audition and she got the part, completely based on public outcry. So it's not a completely unheard of concept. It's pretty common that that's how it works. Another way they might use it is if they're in negotiations with a studio for a role and the studio just isn't moving forward or they're hemming and hawing over their salary. They might plant in the media that they're being considered for another movie that's a big name movie. They're going to try to use the rumor in the press to put pressure on the movie they are negotiating with. Now, we've been discussing examples of people using misinformation and leaked stories well in their own favor, but I want to point you towards a very recent story from 2015 where this tactic completely backfired. Todd Corser and Cindy Gamrett were state legislators for the state of Michigan. Both were married, both had children, and they were having an extramarital affair, and the rumors were starting to get out. So Todd Corser came up with a plan. He wrote a anonymous email in which he accused himself of having sex with a male prostitute outside a prominent Lansing nightclub. Complete and total lie, hadn't happened. But he wrote this, and he took it to his aide and asked his aide to accidentally send it out to all the Republicans. It was a self-smear campaign that he thought would inoculate him against the scandal of an actual affair coming out. He figured that it would inoculate the herd and make anything else that comes out after that, as long as it isn't a video, mundane and tame by comparison. He wanted it to be ridiculous and over the top, and referred to it as a controlled burn. In a controlled burn, you do a little bit of truth mixed in with a lot of lies. So he was hoping that if he wrote this email anonymously accusing himself of some huge big scandal that could easily be proven false, if the real scandal of his affair came out, no one would believe it, and they would just assume it was part of an election smear campaign. But his aide declined to send the email and recorded their conversations, and those recordings got out. And that's how this entire issue was discovered. Both Corser and Gamrett were removed from office, were censured, and it completely backfired. With and without technology, this has been happening for a long time. People have always found ways to manipulate perceptions in print, in person, to control how people view them and really take over their competition. If you liked this episode, consider leaving us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or social media. You can find snark, updates, and behind-the-scenes peeks at production on Twitter. Our handle is @HiddenBiz. That's @HiddenBiz. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business. Music for this podcast is from the album Time Within Itself by Michael Waldrop and used with permission of the artist. You can find out more about it on iTunes and Amazon. If you'd like to access show notes and multimedia content and the periodic rant from your hosts, be sure to visit our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com.